everyone. Welcome to the French Art Museum. Today we are presenting our first time doing a history brunch. We are working on doing these early Saturday morning presentations that we hope you come visit us in person. We'll be offering some snacks and, of course, the best part, a little bit of a history lesson. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bernard Harris, and he's going to talk to us about Western University during World War II. One. Oh my goodness, one. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. My name is Dr. Bernard Harris, and our discussion this morning is going to be about Western University. Western University was a historical black college that operated in Quindaro, Kansas from 1881 to 1943. And I'll go into the details of how it came about and how it ended. Okay, so specifically, my brief is going to center on what Western University did for the U.S. Army, specifically for African American soldiers in World War I, because we had a segregated service at that time. So Western University joined a lot of white universities, such as, and I'll talk about black Americans and white Americans in this presentation, but such as K-State, such as KU, they also did similar programs to Western University. Okay? So one of the first things is, if you look through your family records, you're going to come across old pictures. And I love to look at old pictures like this because they tell us a lot of information. Okay? One of the biggest things is, you notice everybody's got a Montana hat on. All right? Montana hat was pretty much the garrison hat while you were in the United States before you shipped out overseas. Some troops did take their Montana hats over, but the majority of them left them here in the United States because it's just hard to maintain if you're in a combat situation. And these cords here, they would have cord colors on them. If they were yellow, that means you're cavalry. If they're blue, it means you're infantry. If they're red, it means you're artillery. Okay, just for example. There were other codes. But as you can see here, most of the pictures during that time were all staged. But we have one older gentleman right here who most likely, I'll get into this in a few minutes, was an instructor at Western University. Okay, so it's a key thing to know here is that U.S. Army instructors did not teach these gentlemen about any of their skills. Okay, the university had to produce their own instructors. So what they're doing right here, as you can see right down here at the bottom, they're building cement sidewalks and actually improving the school. Okay, so I will follow this agenda. First off, when we get into the location of the university, I came across quite a few people that were like, okay, where is it? Okay, so I'm including that in the presentation, and then going through these various other topics right here. Okay? And if you have any specific questions, I would just ask if you could hold them until we get to the end, just so that way we stay on time. And then I'll entertain questions after. All right, first off, the location of Western University. This right here is an early map set up in 1856 because the initial idea was we're going to have some businessmen get together and we're going to form a town and we're going to have all the railroads come through this town and we're going to make some money. Okay? And then the Wyandotte Native American tribe was also involved because they owned the land initially. Okay, but this was the early layout of what it was, Quindaro was supposed to look like. Okay, so if you take this part of the map right up here and I blew it up so that way you can see Quindaro is right here. You see the initial plan was to have all these railroads come into Quindaro. Down here is Kansas City. As you can see, it really doesn't have a lot of railroads coming in. But this is all the original plan of Quindaro. In order to generate money, the businessmen wanted to get the railroads to come in, and the railroads initially made some promises that they were coming, but as we know, that didn't really happen. But this was the idea. So you had Missouri on this side, and that's Platte and Clay County, Missouri, and then you have Wyandotte County, Kansas, over on the south side of the Missouri River. All right, then we move back to the main map here, in which case this area, Quindaro, is blown up into the bigger map. We've got the Missouri River here. I marked off the approximate location of Western University and its limits. And then we have a few things that are actually still on Google Maps that you can go ahead and just punch in Google Maps right now and drive to. Okay? One is the overlook, in which case that's overlooking the Missouri River. Right now it's like a big gazebo. And then you have the John Brown statue. It's a white statue and it's still there. And I'll show a picture of the John Brown statue when we get to the end. Okay? Then all this is based off the approximate location of the Quindaro Park that's still there. Right? So that gives you an idea of where the school is. Now, I will tell you, this area right now, they're trying to do some revitalization in there because now it's kind of low income. You'll see a lot of trees and stuff overgrown over quite a few things, but there is plans with Kansas City, Kansas to go ahead and revitalize that area. And part of my research is going towards helping with that revitalization. Now, one thing before I continue, I've got the article that this presentation is based off of is published in the Kansas History Journal. Okay, so I have one article in that journal already in the yellow book right here. That's dealing with segregation in Kansas. And this presentation is built on my second article, which is in the brown book right here. Okay, the only thing is you can only read the abstract in the Kansas Historical Society. They usually leave it hidden for about a year, and then everybody can read it in public. So they kind of want people to go ahead and subscribe. However, my segregation in Kansas article came out in 22, like right when I was getting ready to graduate, so you can read that online. Okay? All right, to start off with, why did people want to even come to the Quindaro area, especially among Black Americans? All right? So, one of the biggest things was escape slavery. Because just like I had pointed out, where Platte County and Clay County, those were known as Little Dixie. You had a lot of plantations over there, and you had quite a few slaves over there. So for the slaves to get free, Kansas was still a free territory, wasn't a state yet. All right? Missouri had accepted slavery as part of the economic situation. Kansas abolitionists wanted to keep slavery out. So for a slave in Missouri, they just needed to get across the Missouri River, okay, and survive getting across that. They could link up with other abolitionists who would try to continue them on the Underground Railroad, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with. So that's when we get into Miss Nichols right here. She was an abolitionist that came to the area. She opened up a newspaper that operated in Quindaro. And she actually turned her home into a station on the Underground Railroad where there was one slave woman, her name was Caroline, who on the Missouri side was trying to keep her daughter from being sold into slavery and sent further south. She got into a tussle with the slave master and got her arm broken. But then later on, she was able to escape from that plantation over in Platte County, get across to Missouri, but now during this time, there were quite a few slave catchers riding around in Kansas territory, and they were riding around trying to round up any slaves that had gotten across the Missouri River. So when Caroline came up to Miss Nichols hid her in a cistern and then covered her up, okay? And then, so the slave catchers didn't get her, and then the next day, Miss Nichols actually was able to help smuggle her further north, going up towards Nebraska along the Underground Railroad. So Kansas and Quindaro area had a role to play in as a station in the Underground Railroad. Now, the Wyandotte tribe of Indians, that was their name back then. Now they're the Wyandotte Nation of Kansas. And one thing I would mention to everybody, and I got this directly from one of their chiefs, you have to be careful on the spelling. If it's two T's, that's the Wyandotte Nation that's down in Oklahoma. You have one T that's here, still here in the Kansas Center. Okay? So this is what they were called. This was their name back during this period. And they were also abolitionists. A few of them did have slaves, but there was quite a few that were abolitionists, and they also helped runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad. Now, the city of Quindaro actually got incorporated in 1857. All right, so you had that initial map. And they had about 600 people actually inhabited Quindaro. All right, Miss Nichols had the newspaper. I mean, it was pretty much a prosperous area. But by time we get into the Civil War, because the Civil War starts in 1861, a lot of manpower starts leaving. Okay? A lot of families start leaving. So now that 600 population starts to drop. And since it did start to drop, Quindaro ended up being absorbed into KCK. Okay? And then that's pretty much how Quindaro is just a small little section of the bigger Kansas City, Kansas area. Now, one of the people that came along was a good reverend right here, who in 1857 realized we have all these slaves coming across the Missouri River, and they're bringing their families with them. But now they've also, with their families, had kids, and we need to educate these people. Okay, so he took it upon himself, along with other abolitionists, to actually set up homeschooling. Okay, so they started teaching these runaway slave children how to read and write. Now remember, under slave laws, especially in Missouri, you teach a slave how to read or write, you're in trouble, okay, as a white person that's doing it. So that was actually a very dangerous thing for him to do, and the other people to do here in Quindaro. So they did it anyway because they saw a need, and he's recognized as pretty much the father of, the founder of education for Black Americans in the Quindaro area. He later dies in about 1877, okay? But he was very, very influential in the creation of Freedmen's University, which I'll talk about here. We're going to talk about here now. Freedmen's University, and this Freedmen's University specifically was for free men were going to teach their kids. And eventually they would teach adults, okay? Because one of the things is why this is so important to me is because my PhD is in adult learning and leadership, but they allowed me to do an interdisciplinary with history, so I've pretty much become an educational historian, okay? So it was kind of unique in my mind as far as you're teaching free men and their families, so you're going to call the university Free Man's University, okay? So as you can see here, those are the years that it operated. Now, while this university stood up, okay, in a lot of ways it was really a high-speed high school, all right, there was still quite a bit of resistance to integrating schools, okay? So some of the schools that got set up in around the Wyandotte County and the Quindaro area, out of about 14 schools, actually 2 of them, based on the information I was able to find, were burned. Okay, I don't know if they were completely burned down, but they suffered fire damage. Some of the other schools, the books got stolen. Okay, so now, you got a school, there's no books. So there was all this resistance because the white population did not want to educate black children based on their, with their taxpayer money. Okay, so with that going on, all right, the Kansas legislature, quite a few of them were supported by other abolitionists, turned around and said, okay, we're not going to have that. We're actually going to fund the school. So the Kansas legislature started funding and providing money in 1867, but then they had to cut it off in 1873 because of budget cuts. Quite a few people in 1873 were complaining, we got to reduce taxes. So since we got to reduce taxes, that means we got to cut back on all these programs that we provide money to. So they actually cut. They kept money going, but they cut. So for any school, as you can realize, if you're used to a certain budget coming in, even though Freedmen's University was constantly asking for more money, but you have a certain amount of money coming in, all of a sudden that gets cut down. Okay, that's going to impact you big time for faculty, for maintaining facilities in school, maintaining supplies for the students is going to impact you big time. All right, so let me just say for head counts, and I wrote this down, for head counts, in 1868 we had 72 students. In 1870 you get up to about 100 students, so the head count's starting to rise. Okay, but again, it was really, even though it was called university, it was really a high-speed high school. Okay, now, since the funding was starting to get cut here, we had to go a couple of years, in which case the only money we're getting is money from tuition, money from some donors, and a couple of dollars from some other benefactors, but they never were able to get the big endowments like Tuskegee University or Howard University. I mean, at one point, Booker T. Washington was able to get Mr. Carnegie, the big industrialist. He wrote them a check for like $2 million. I mean, and this is like, I mean, it was later, especially when we got up into the 1900s. But I mean, that was a lot of money. Freeman University never had any kind of endowments. And all the research I've been able to find, I can't come up with a reason why, but they just never got those big endowments. And see, in a lot of cases with all of our big historical colleges like Harvard, Cornell, and all these other big schools, the people that graduate will turn around, they'll become successful, and they'll give these big donations back to the school. So, but with a school like this, just like Tuskegee, that population aren't going to become that wealthy that fast or that many people. So they didn't really have big people that have become wealthy business owners to give money back. Some did, okay? And some did that graduated Tuskegee were able to give money back. But for Western University, I haven't found anybody that really made it real big and were able to give any kind of serious money. Now, Booker T. Washington getting money from Carnegie, I mean, he pretty much guaranteed he could keep the school going, indefinitely. But Freeman's University at this time was really hurtful, okay, as far as funds. So by the time we get to 1880s, you get the African American Methodist Episcopal Church kicks in. They already were running Wilberforce University, so they had some experience running schools, okay. So they saw an opportunity to back up Western University because then they can go ahead and put specifically more money into the religious education and actually get more preachers trained up to go out to the community. Okay, so it was a benefit for the church as well. And then by the time when the church gets involved in 1881, so about a year after the church gets involved, everybody agreed we need to change the name of the school because the Freeman name no longer really applies. Okay, because Civil War was over in 1865. So now they changed the name to Western University. And the board of directors that was running the show with Freeman's University just transferred everything over to the new board of directors. All right, now we get into one of the most famous individuals to actually serve as the principal for Western University, and that's the Reverend William Vernon. Okay, now Vernon actually was in charge of the school 2 times, but in my research dealing with World War I, he pretty much pertains just 1 time during this period. Okay, just to let you know he did come back. So the year 1896 actually turned into both a blessing and a little bit of a curse for Western University. The curse part starts off with Plessy versus Ferguson. That's a big Supreme Court case, in which case the federal government said that the states are allowed to segregate their populations in public places, which meant that, for example, if you're riding on a train in Missouri, if you're African American, black person of color, you have to go to the back of the bus, okay, or the back of the train car. And if you're white, you get to sit up front, no questions asked, okay. And based on where you're seating, based on what your skin color is. So that also pertained not only to trains, it pertained to movie theaters, it pertained to anything in public spaces. And then that's when you really down south, you got into the black and white the signs on the war signs, okay, carrying it to the extreme. Now in the Army, okay, the Army, we had one paradigm going from, now let me first back up. During the American Revolution, we had integrated units. And any unit, even in Valley Forge, if one of the state colonial militias formed up on the parade field of Valley Forge, you would see dots of black Americans in the formation, okay? And it was, George Washington at that time was like, okay, that's okay. Even though he didn't have a policy to actively recruit slaves into the colonial army, right? But they were integrated. If you just looked at a typical colonial unit walking down the street, you're going to see a little bit of everybody in that formation. Then we get into the Civil War, in which case now we have units that are formed up of African Americans, such as the Red Lakes here in Kansas, and also 54th Massachusetts, but you have white officers. you really only had one famous black officer, and that was a gentleman named Delaney, okay? And he was promoted to officer. He hadn't gone to West Point, but it was more of a propaganda deal, like the last couple of months of the war, to get more African Americans involved in the war for the Union. Okay, Confederacy never, they talked about it near the end of the war, but they never actively recruited black Americans into the Confederate forces. Now, so fast forward, when we get up to getting ready to go into, well, Spanish American War was similar to the Civil War, but now we get up into World War I. One of the things was up in Plattsburgh, New York, the U.S. Army set up a whole bunch of almost like high-speed YMCA camps to train regular civilians in military tactics, okay? And quite a few white Americans, especially those with a little bit of money, went to Plattsburgh and received this training on artillery, on shooting, marching, drill and ceremony, and all that. However, they completely excluded any black Americans that showed up. Like, nope, you're not allowed to do this. Okay? So, even though quite a few black Americans had tried to do it, they were rejected. Now, that's going on when we're getting into World War I, and then we had West versus Ferguson, so that's the issue beginning of 1896. The good part of 1896, where Western University is specifically involved, is that Vernon is elected president. Now, we had two big philosophies for black American education at the time. You had Booker T. Washington was saying we need to go ahead and people need to develop a skill, become economically independent, and then we can shoot for civil rights. But then you also had on the other side of the coin W.E.B. Du Bois, who became the editor for the Crisis newspaper, which was for the NAACP, who said, no, first we need to go for civil rights, and then we can go for economic independence. Now, there were various race riots that popped up that kind of influenced people one way or the other, especially the Atlanta race riots, in which case quite a few businesses where black Americans were trying to follow Booker T. Washington's lead as far as becoming economically independent, got burned out. And then they were like, okay, now I'm burned out, I really need to fight for civil rights more than economic rights. So that pushed a lot of people over towards W.E.B. Du Bois' way of thinking. However, for Vernon, he embraced Booker T. Washington, okay? There's a reason for that too. I'll get to it in a second. So by him embracing this, Booker T. Washington's ideas, he now embraces vocational training, okay? You want to teach people a trade and then they'll get civil liberties later. And so he's really saying, hey, we gotta, doing things with your hand it ennobles you, okay? It enables you to really be independent, all right? And that makes you more of an asset to white America if you're doing business for them, okay? Different trades for them and for your own business. So with this, okay, as you can see, now Western University is really starting to teach vocational training. Okay, so they're already starting to teach people how to be carpenters, how to be engineers as far as building bridges, how to handle concrete. And so they're really starting to get into those engineering skills naturally, okay, through the curriculum. When I say natural, I'm talking about through the curriculum. Washington actually came here. So since Vernon was embracing Booker T. Washington's educational philosophy, he invited Mr. Washington to actually come here to Western University. As a matter of fact, a few months before Mr. Washington passed away, because he dies in about 1915, okay? He actually takes a train, comes into Union Station. They actually give him a motor, take him in a car, and actually drive him around Kansas City, 18th and Vine, give him a big tour, and then they drove him up to Quindaro, up to Western University. Brass band met him at the entrance of the school. They escorted him up to the church where he gave a big speech on his philosophy of education. And that's, was able to track all that through local newspapers. Also, with the rest of my research, a lot of my, especially when we get into the military side, That research is coming out of National Archives #2 of College Park, Maryland. Okay? And also quite a bit is coming out of the Keith Spencer Research Center over here at KU. Okay? Where I came across some more information. So I thought that was pretty big, with Washington actually coming here and actually speaking. So now, just like I was saying, Western University is really a high-speed high school because they had built the normal school, okay, and normal school back then was really the name given to a high school. And they were following a philosophy that was similar to quite a few other universities, other schools that call themselves universities. As you can see here, there's like 54 others that call themselves university, but less than 50% were actually teaching in college classes. And since they were calling themselves university, that just attracted more Black Americans because it was like, hey, I can actually say that my son or daughter attended a university when in actuality it was really just a high school. Now, Kansas legislature. They actually, after that budget cut in 1873, they actually kicked back up more money coming back to the school. It started gradually to pick up. And with that additional funds, the 6 main buildings at Western University was built to include Grant Hall, okay, which would turn into one of the bigger buildings on the campus, one of the nicer buildings, and actually female students eventually by World War I were occupying that building. But again, we got budget cuts. So in 13, down here in 15, in which case, the only numbers I was able to come up with for faculty are less than 30. Okay? And so paying faculty was always a constraint because you couldn't really rely every year on, well, it was really biannual, but every 2 years they were getting money from Kansas legislature. You couldn't really bank on how much you were going to get. And then again, like I said before, you get donations, you get student tuition. It's not much else. Okay, so they were always in a money constraint. And this is one of the things that segregation did, in which case, even after you get an education, you can't really expand your horizon and do business with other races in America because everybody wants to keep you in one little section. And so your idea of branching out to really being able to do anything in a segregated society becomes really, really, really limited, right? So down here, as you can see, I was talking earlier as far as the number of students was starting to climb. So now we're starting to actually increase from 99 to 229. But again, the number of students is increasing, but that a little bit of money in additional tuition, and it's for those people who couldn't pay all of that tuition, they were getting, making allowances for them and only had to pay maybe half tuition, okay? That just wasn't enough to make up, to teach this additional amount of students. So the school, again, is constantly struggling with finances while more and more students are showing up. All right, now we get into the vocational training piece. So that's laying the groundwork for how what I was talking about so far is laying the groundwork of how Freeman's University turned into Western University, and now we're going into World War I. And so, as you can see here, this is President Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a rather, I'll just say, he was a rather interesting president. I mean, if you look at some of the records, he had a hand in resegregating the federal government. Okay, so there's quite a few Black Americans that were in key positions and had them all replaced. Not all of the government, but at least half of them. And Woodrow Wilson's coming out of Virginia, I believe, yes. And so that was, and then also Woodrow Wilson was also president to watch the very first motion picture in the White House in 1915. Okay, yeah. Anybody know what that movie was?
Birth of a Nation. Right?
Yep, Birth of a Nation. You got to really watch the 3-hour uncut version. Really get a good feel for that movie. But the bottom line is, if you haven't heard of it, I mean, that's pretty much, the KKK is right on. Okay, they're the greatest Americans on the planet. I'm not going to get political, but that's what the movie's about. So he actually watched the movie with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court sitting right next to him, and after the movie was over, said, "Hey, that was a great movie." Okay, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that's giving you a background of him. Now, as we're getting into World War I, okay, I will say that there was a secretary. The person you picked to be a Secretary of War, Secretary of War Baker, was not like Woodrow Wilson. Secretary of War Baker actually was known as a friend to the NAACP that had started up in about 1909. Okay, so him being a friend to the NAACP, he was able to actually contribute quite a few things to assist Black Americans during this period, especially in the military. Okay, so now Secretary of War Baker didn't specifically have anything to do with the Smith-Hughes Act. I'm just giving that as a little background for if you're interested to go ahead and do your own research. But we had two organizations here, the Douglas Commission, okay, and then you had the National Society for the Promotion of Industrial Education. Now, both of these organizations came about because you had some of the industrialists that was saying people are getting elementary school education, they're getting high school education, but they're not getting any trades education because we need them to work in factories, okay? But they're not getting any training as far as how to actually operate machinery. Okay, so that costs us money as industrialists because now I got to do extra training to get these people up to speed. So these folks need to be going to some kind of follow-on school after high school to get trained up, like what we have today, a trade school. That didn't exist back then, right? So you had an industrial need to have people trained up before they come work in the factory. Now, we had educators like John Dewey who turned around and said, "Nah, I don't agree with that." Okay? John Dewey was like, okay, you can train someone to do laundry, at the industrial level, okay? But you need to also teach them why doing laundry is important. Show them what the economic impact of that laundry is, okay? But the industrialists were like, no, we just need somebody trained in doing task 1, 2, 3, and 4, and just repeat that over and over again all day. 1, 2, 3, and 4. We don't have time to teach them, philosophy behind it. So even though Dewey disagreed, okay, he had to acquiesce because these two organizations, as you can see, they had done studies in 4 states plus Tuskegee, the Douglas Commission, all right? And then this other society down here actually looked at 38 states to include Kansas to come up with their recommendations that more needs to be done for vocational training. We need to train these folks. So they were able to get the federal government through Congress and eventually to the desk of President Wilson to sign, okay, stating that we are going to give money to colleges and high schools to go ahead and start teaching vocational skills. Okay, so that way they can graduate from there and they can go into the modern industrial world and work in the factory. So that's where all this money got allocated. However, this was voluntary. It wasn't mandatory. And each state had to match funds. So if a state got X amount of dollars from the federal government, that state had to match those funds with their own funds. Now, each state got a chance to vote on this, and as you can see, Kansas passed this legislation first time go with 39 other states. So now, with the Smith-Hughes Act, you've got colleges and high schools starting to train vocational skills. But this is all happening this is just months before World War I starts. World War I for the United States starts in April of 17. So it's only February, March, and April. Really weren't able to graduate too many people in that short amount of time. However, by starting that program, the Army now, once war is declared, has something to fall, not necessarily fall back on, but something to actually utilize the capability that they can tap into. So we had the Declaration of War in 17. Of course, we're not ready. Okay? I say of course because we got caught flat-footed in World War II too. Okay? So now, when we're starting to draft all these people coming into service, because we grew from an army of 200,000, now by the end of World War I, we're looking at 4 million. But we're starting to draft all these folks, and we're finding out a lot of them can't read and write. Okay? illiteracy, along with these lack of vocational skills, was going to hurt us, because now World War I is a big industrial war. We got tanks, we've got aircraft, we've got trucks. You still have a lot of people living on the farm, and they never even seen a car. Okay, so you got to get them trained up in all this. So again, the Smith-Hughes Act has only been around for a few months. That's slow producing any people with any real skills in the industrial sense. So now the War Department stands up this committee, all right? And with that committee, their job is to go out and take a look at all these schools that are teaching vocational skills and see how, what their vocational programs are all about. Because they're operating with a need. Their need was these infantry divisions, they needed over 50 different vocational skills, going from blacksmiths all the way up to watchmakers. All right, so these requirements are already, and those of us that's in the military, we know we're all about requirements. These requirements are already being established. Well, they're already known. Okay, so now we just got to fill the slots with people with these skills. As you can see here, colleges now, since they were already doing vocational training, are now asked to, they're invited to go ahead and contract as contractors with the War Department, because today we call it the Defense Department, back then we called it the War Department. Contract with the War Department, and also it gives the schools PR, so that way they can say that they're supporting the war. Okay? We're asking universities to contract with the War Department, but one of the stipulations is they got to be able to take 100 draftees at one time. Okay? Then we get, once these draftees show up at the school, now the War Department is establishing a certain training regimen, so you're looking at about 8 weeks, 9 hours of training. Draft boards were told that, hey, we need you to go out and see who's coming in, registering for the draft, and ask who's got different skills out there already. So if you've got people that have these skills, some people were already trained mechanics, some people were already trained truck drivers. If they already have these skills, when they're actually registering, then we can go ahead and fast track them to these colleges and universities, maybe even act like instructors. Now, one of the segregation pieces I have right here is called cut the corner, in which case it was an administrative thing, in which case on your registration form, you filled out that, what race you were. So if you said African American, colored was a term for the time, then the left corner of your registration card was cut. So that way, if you had a stack of cards as the draft board representative sitting at that draft board location as people coming in, filling out the registration cards and handing it to you, if you have a stack of cards, you can see all the ones that have a left corner cut, you could easily separate those as far as, okay, those are all Black Americans over here. As you can see, that creates a big stigma. This is just like anything else. If we sat in here and said, okay, all men over here, all women over there, or everybody with glasses, you're over here. I mean, that automatically sets things apart. And as you can see, that created a lot of bad blood, and some organizations did protest that to the War Department with Secretary War Baker, and there was 4 draft registrations for World War I. They were only doing that cut in the corner for 2 of them, so by the time you get to the last 2, that stopped. Okay? So Secretary War Baker got involved and was like, okay, we're not going to do that. But one of the things is with these vocational training programs at these schools, Emmett Scott, who used to be pretty much the second in charge of Tuskegee University with Booker T. Washington, and then Booker T. Washington passed away in 15. He is big time connected within the Black community, and Secretary War Baker says, hey, I need somebody that knows the Black community. I need you, sir, to come and help me. So he gets assigned as a special assistant to the Secretary of War Baker's staff to actually keep a pulse on the Black community for the war, because there were fears that a lot of Blacks would not support the war. So Emmett Scott gets involved, and now he turns around and finds out that all these colleges and universities that are being asked to contract with the War Department, none of them are Black universities. Okay, and he's like, hey, we got to change that. So now the word goes out to Black universities, and there were only 10 that were actually picked out of 19. And Western University was one of those 10. So that's pretty much Western University's big claim to fame at this point. Okay? So that was a big honor for them. So now, the impact on campus. And this is where it gets a little personal because Dr. Keeling, in which case, if you go to Quindaro right now, they actually know where his president's house was. He's got to deal with a whole bunch of stressors that turns around and contributes to him passing away on February 18th. Okay? His head count's climbing. Again, he's got no money. Okay? Limited budget. Just like I said, no money. Consumer prices are going up. Guess what? He can't pay these instructors enough, and a lot of the instructors were saying, hey, we're just getting paid high school teacher wages. Okay? So instructors are leaving. The draft is taking away instructors and students. For example, the Jackson Jubilee Singers was one of the biggest things that Western University was able to export out to the world. They started going around just like Fisk University had Jubilee Singers going out and singing around the country, making money, and drawing attention to Western University, just like with Fisk. And now all of a sudden, one of his instructors, music instructors, get drafted. That's a big impact on the music program. Then this historian Murray, I found his records over in the Kenneth Spencer Research Center over at Cade. He doesn't have any references to his work. So he's not saying where he got his stuff from. So it's really hard to reconfirm where his stuff came from. Having said that, he says in his records that there was actually a vocational training program that was teaching engineer skills that started up from September to December of 1917. But the school, Western University's annual reports, and their biannual reports, don't mention it. So I'm not sure if it happened, not sure if it didn't happen. Okay? But he mentions it. And he's known as a local historian in the area. So I feel obligated to at least mention it. So all of this contributes to Keeling passing away in February. I mean, he had some other health issues too, but it did help. Now, the campus is turning into a military camp. Okay, so now you're civilian, because they're still teaching civilian students on campus, over 200 of them. Okay, and as you'll see in a minute, I mean, the school actually trained over 300 soldiers with limited staff and faculty, okay, and limited funds. So they pulled off pretty much a little bit of a miracle in the modern sense, okay? But your civilian students are noticing the soldiers all over the place now. They're marching all over the place. They got bugle calls at all different hours of the day. And so for somebody that's a straight civilian, all of a sudden to be finding themselves in the middle of a military camp, that could be kind of traumatic, okay? However, there was strong support in the black community, especially in the black newspapers, as far as promoting the whole vocational program, okay? So that was guaranteeing that more people were hearing about it, because we didn't have all the high-speed communications we have today, okay? So you're mainly getting your information from word of mouth or from the newspaper. And so these advertisements that were in the paper, you read Sunday Times or newspapers come out daily, and sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. So you're reading the newspaper and then you hear about this, and it's like, hey, I've been a car mechanic ever since cars just came out 20 years ago. So hey, I can go ahead and contribute my skills for the war effort. Okay, and that's part of this poster right here, which says, as you can read here, "Colored man is no slacker," showing that the black community was supporting the war effort, in which case a lot of people, to include W.E.B. Du Bois, was hoping that support in the war would hopefully, after the war, guarantee more civil rights after the war was over. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And that led to W.E.B. Du Bois being real depressed after World War I was over. Now, on campus, again, Grand Hall, I mentioned before, when it was built based on more funding that was coming in a couple of years before World War I starts. and this was the nicest building on campus, and it was a female dormitory. As you can see right here, the females were asked to move out in order to make room for soldiers. So this technically turns into a barracks. And if you look really close right here, you have a soldier marching, and he has his rifle on his right shoulder as he's walking guard mount in front of the building. So Professor French takes over after Keeling passes away. He turns around and does quite a few things. First off, he has to shut the school down a little early because they just don't have funds. Okay, so that was a hard decision. So yeah, a lot of students were really happy about that. However, the faculty weren't, because now they had to accelerate what they were teaching in order to get everything done at the time that school had to close. French turns around and says, we haven't been accredited by the Board of Education here in Kansas ever, so let's go ahead and do that. And so that changes a whole bunch of the curriculum in order to make that happen in the way they do their business practices, because he's hoping that if they can pass accreditation, maybe the legislature will give them some more money. Then at the same time, he turns around and says, hey, this whole War Department contract thing, do vocational training. We're already doing vocational training, so we should be perfect. So let's go ahead and apply. Okay, and then they get accepted. Now, you turn into an issue now where the money that the federal government's going to give you is a two-edged sword. On the short term, that money they give you, the inspector, when they came down to the university and looked, the inspectors, and they looked at the university and say, hey, you have a lot of good facilities here, but we're going to send you 100 soldiers, so you need to have more of this kind of shop and more of this kind of shop. So we're going to give you X amount of dollars, but out of that money, French now figures out, I got to spend some of that money to buy all this extra equipment. However, after the war is over, I get to keep the equipment. So that's the long-term gain. So he turned around and said, long-term gain is better than short-term, let's do it. And I've already mentioned about the females giving up their dormitory. So now we get into the actual documented training that happens at Western University. As you can see here, this is an example of draftees that are doing electrical, setting up electrical telephone poles. They're setting wires on top of telephone poles. Because for the vocational program, pretty much once you were drafted and you received your draft notice, okay, remember we're doing Western Union and snail mail with mail. But when you got your draft notice in the mail, you were either told to show up at a location such as Camp Funston, right out here next to Fort Riley, okay, to begin your basic training, or based on vocational skills, okay, that you've already identified to the draft board when you went to actually fill out your draft card before you got your notice that you were being drafted. You had to fill out the draft card first. So now you might get notice that you're going to go to Western University. So you would show up at Western University in civilian clothes and some suitcases, and now you got to receive all your equipment and everything else from the university. In which case, they're going to have non-commissioned officers take charge of you. They're going to put you in uniform. You're going to go to Grand Hall, go to the barracks, and then you're going to begin your duty day based on those weeks of training, as you can see up here. So we had 3 contingents that's documented. I found in my annual record. So the first one is occurring here, June to August, then August to October, and then October to December. These pictures that you're going to see right here, this one in particular, were all done at about the 10th of December. Okay, so technically the war is over, but someone went down and took some pictures of these guys training. And so for me, telling this story, that turns around, that's a little bit of godsend, okay, as far as information. So going back to the first contingent, I mean, you can see right here, we had 105 people, mostly from Kansas. This gentleman right here, Clyde, I actually got records of him making a comment about his electrical class. He scored 3rd highest on a particular test that they were given. He's like, oh, this work is easy. But it's not necessarily easy because standards were lower based on white soldiers going through vocational training and black soldiers going through. All the War Department was real specific. All training is going to be the same. Everybody's getting the same standard because we can't discriminate, because when they get to a combat zone, everybody's got to be able to do the same thing. So, yes, it was easy for him because he was already familiar with electrical. Okay? Now, for education, a lot of this is instructor almost tells you when to pick a pen up or pencil up to actually turn around and write something. Okay, it's real draconian. However, the students were allowed that if you had accelerated skills better than your rest of your classmates, you were allowed to continue on at your own pace. Okay, and so that way nobody was holding anybody back. So that was one big advantage that I saw with this vocational training. So then now, as I said before, we got the same standard. These are the skills that they were receiving in his very first class. Then you have the second contingent. You're looking at soldiers coming out of Mississippi. And then Sergeant Brown, he's one of the only NCOs that came across a specific name. He actually took 65 soldiers, and locals in Kansas City actually gave him dinner. So it just shows more support within the black community. Now, in comparison, Western's teaching that many soldiers, but you can see here, Hampton and K-State, how many soldiers they were teaching. But they also had a lot bigger budgets. Okay? Similar training to the first contingent there. Now, during this period, dealing with Spanish flu. I mean, that's a high number. Okay? Very high number. Well, civilian funeral parlors were overwhelmed. The military was overwhelmed. I mean, in some cases, you're just doing a whole bunch of mass burials. You have bulldozers, big holes, and you start putting the bodies in there. Okay? Now, Heck replaces French on the 1st of September. And then we get into the last contingent, and these again coming out of Kansas and Missouri this time. And they're getting the same type of training, but they're also receiving training in automobile repair, driving cars. And now, at this point, this was a piece of information that I came across in National Archives number 2 that really intrigued me. In which case, the Army starts complaining in October that we don't have any place to put all these additional people coming out of vocational training. I mean, and we need to send out a signal to all these HBCUs on 2 things. One, the War Department is not giving you money for vocational training, just keep your school open. Okay? And 2, that, hey, what are we going to do, because we got all these people being trained up, but these black units are already full. So if you have the 92nd Division, which was African American Division, okay, all your NCOs and a few of your officers were black Americans. Those few officers that were black Americans were trained at the only officer training camp up in Fort Des Moines for black officer training. Okay, and they were mainly second lieutenants, first lieutenants, and a few captains. But all the other senior officers were all white. But if the 92nd Division only had a need for, I would just say a number, 10 truck drivers. Well, we've got all these people coming out of vocational training at Western University, Tuskegee, Howard Universities, other black universities that also were contracted with the War Department. And we got 50 of them. Well, what are they going to do? They have no place to go. Okay? I mean, yeah, you put them in a replacement unit, but where are they going? So that turned into a problem. And that was mainly a problem because of the racist policies at the time. Because if a unit was able to accept anybody, they would have plenty of places to go. Okay? But that actually turned into a little bit of an issue in October of 1918. All right. Coming down to the close, in which case now, looking at the numbers, if we include Murray's first contingent, we're looking at 415. If we don't include Murray, we're looking at 345 draftees actually were trained to standard at Western University. But at the same time, they were teaching 275 civilian school students. And again, with a limited budget, a limited number of faculty. And now here, this is where the leadership of Western University went to the governor, Arthur Capper, and said, hey, we're one of the best educational institutions in the country. And they're making that statement trying to get additional money from the Kansas legislature. Most of these gentlemen went overseas, and they were all African American men, no women at the time. They go overseas, and most of them become part of the Services Supply Organization, known as the SOS, in which case now many of them turn into stevedores, they actually turn into pioneers, engineers, repairing roads, repairing bridges, because only about 40,000 Black American troops actually got into the 92nd and the 93rd Divisions and actually saw combat. Okay, so the vast majority of the rest of the Black Americans were all back in what was known as the base area, back near the ports of Brest and Bordeaux, actually unloading and loading ships or doing some kind of repairs back in the area. Some of them got, especially the pioneer units, got to move forward to the front lines, but they were still not necessarily on the front line. So then they turn around and they come back, and as you can see, quite a few of them took those skills because Emmett Smith had said in the very beginning that the War Department actually, knowingly or unknowingly, by training all these individuals with vocational skills, actually gave them skills that after the war they can bring back and actually help the community. So as you can see, they fulfilled Emmett Smith's prediction, in which case they come back and they're lawyers, mail carriers, business owners, and and a lot of them joined the American Legion, because quite a few veterans coming out of World War I joined the American Legion. And they were able to really do productive work with their local community, especially back here in Kansas, okay, after the war was over. Now, we get to 1943, and that's when Western University is really hitting on hard times, because with that limited funds coming in, and then changing times, the AME church is starting to run out of money. They have to pull funding. Kansas legislature turns around and says, hey, we got another school, especially by the time we get to World War II, we got other schools that are teaching trades now, okay? So we really don't need to support Western University because we got other schools that can do it too. So now the state legislature pulls their funding, and that pretty much kills the school. However, Grant Hall continues to go, but it's turned into a hospital. And then eventually that closes in 1978. And if you go to Quindaro now, you'll see the John Brown statue. Right behind the John Brown statue, you're going to see a very big area of just overgrown trees and everything. If they cut all that down, the ruins of those schools, those buildings are still there. And one of the initiatives is to turn around and clean that area up and put a park over there, and actually put some plaques up and stuff like that. But right now, you're really not going to see that much. Okay. They've got the Vernon Multi-Purpose Center that's right across the street from John Brown statue. And that's right now in need of repair, and they got some money to go ahead and make some more repairs on that particular building. And this slide right here, this shows members of the 302nd Engineer Regiment repairing some roads here. So you got black troops here, and then you have white troops standing right behind it. So, I mean, everybody was still in close proximity, but for command and control, you had definite separation between the units based on race. And that pretty much concludes my presentation. This is a picture of the John Brown statue that's standing up right now, as you can see. And just to if I'm facing that to the left, is the Vernon Center right across the street. Okay, and then this is another picture of draftees who are receiving their initial training, continuing to do more concrete work on one of the buildings there at Western. And so right behind the John Brown statue, you see these woods here. This is the woods that I'm talking about, that the remains of these buildings can still be seen if they cut down all the trees and the overgrown bushes and stuff. So that concludes my formal brief. I open it up for questions. Yes, ma'am.
Have you gone on site to go look at those remnants of the buildings?
I have walked around on the road.
Yeah.
I haven't been. Technically, I have to get a machete and cut trail. I mean, there's a few trails. You walk further towards to the right of the statue. That's where you have that overlook, which is like a gazebo. If you go down there, if you go to the gazebo, you got a real narrow view of the Missouri River that's been cut out between the trees. There's a few trails going down there. I just haven't walked down there yet. But I've met quite a few people from there who have. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you mentioned a little bit about the funding being taken up at the end, but you mentioned the funding being slowly taken away throughout time. Have you found anything, or do you look into this stuff, whether that's more of like, towards like, there's being more racist people in the legislature, like, we should fund this, African American, university, or is it just, they just decided we just don't have the money in our budget to go to this university?
The information I was able to come up with back in the 1870s, 1873, it was more racist. But after that, it all became, hey, taxes too high, we gotta do budget cuts. And I have to admit, Kansas legislation was cutting things straight across the board. So there might have been a little hidden racism in there, but from what I could find, it was mainly economic. We just need to cut funding for all these other programs across the board. So as pressure eased up on taxes, then the money would grow again. And then as soon as the burden as far as taxes kicked in, enough people said, "Hey, we got to lower the taxes." Then the cuts started. Sorry.
Was this related at all to the vocational component of the Student Army Training Corps, or a totally separate program done by a certain college?
This was different.
Okay.
This was separate. Because a lot of this came about with this. If it wasn't connected to that Smith-Hughes Act, this was all connected to the Smith-Hughes Act.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense because Student Army Training Corps didn't have to start
Correct.
late. This actually predated it by a couple months now, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. The Smith-Hughes Act was the thing that really brought this all about, because the money was given to these universities to start training vocational skills, and with that money, now when the War Department would go to war, a couple months later, the War Department's like, hey, we have something we can tap into, because we can't set up all these advanced individual training schools like we have today. Known for the Army, known as AIT. Okay, so you go to basic training, and then you go to AIT to learn your job skill. Well, since the Army was growing with this draft, they didn't have enough locations or enough instructors to actually set up AIT locations. So it's a lot easier just to turn around and tap into something that's already happening, such as these schools that are already providing vocational training through the Smith-Hughes Act. Let's just tap them. We'll just send soldiers to them and let them train soldiers. But, oh, by the way, we're not going to give them instructors. Give them a couple dollars, though, that's about it. Ma'am.
Yeah, you had mentioned that the Spanish flu had happened at about the same time. In light of that, did we see an expansion in terms of medical training, or maybe medical service in addition to the vocational training that's happening?
That would be a separate area outside of this research, because this was mainly just dealing with vocational skills. But on the medical side, I would just say, especially when we stood up the officer training camp up at Fort Des Moines, they actually would train. There's a book out there, 104 volunteers, African American doctors. In which case, I would highly encourage you to take a look at that book. In which case, the officer training camp at Fort Des Moines actually trained infantry officers, and they also trained medical officers. And they actually graduated about 104. And Mr. Douglas Fisher, who I had the opportunity to actually go and visit down in Florida and talk to, he got a lot of his information from his great-grandfather, who actually was a captain in one of the regiments for the 92nd Division, and actually talked about these black medical officers that came to the unit. And I was able to assist in having his grandfather's records sent to the National World War I Museum, so that just gives a plug, in which case soon they're going to digitize everything and have it online for everybody to read. And one of the things I saw was interesting in there is that some of his notes, his relatives, I think it was his grandfather's notes, were written on toilet paper. Great handwriting. I mean, because he's in the field. I mean, everybody's not going to have, he's in a war zone. Everybody's not going to have a great, lined piece of paper. Yeah, write on whatever you have. Did I answer your question? Sorry.
Their accreditation, did they ever lose their accreditation?
Yes.
I have a second question. What was the criteria for instructors? What did they have to do or be? They have to have a degree?
Yeah, I didn't get in deep into their specific requirements, but I would probably say, looking, if you go to, Kansas legislature has some real good records. If you go and check that, you can find out exactly what the criteria was. The biggest thing was that for accreditation, I do know that the accreditation for white schools, they had the same, just like the water department had the same standards for the black schools. And since Western University had never got accredited before, they had a lot of stuff to do in order to come up to speed with these other schools, because they actually sent a representative from the Board of Education for Kansas actually showed up and actually did a full inspection for, okay, how are your instructors trained? What's their knowledge level? I mean, are they doing everything to standard? So technically during the war period I'm talking about here, Western University had two standards. They had to maintain for their civilian accreditation standard, and then they also had to maintain the War Department standard for soldiers. So you had all that going on all at the same time. And for those of us who work in education, dealing with accreditation, that's a lot of work. But in answer, I didn't get into the specifics as far as exactly what each instructor has. You hands up first, go, and then man.
Talked about the increase and the decrease in the faculty ratio, and brought down to 22 there. What was the number there towards the end, whenever they were doing both, the vocational training program as well as the civilians? So
I wasn't able to find exactly. They didn't put that in their annual report. When you look at their annual reports, I mean, they actually wrote little books. I mean, it gets you can look at it online or actually get the actual booklets, little small blue and white booklets from Ken Spencer Research Center. They don't go into how many exact faculty. Now they've got lists in the back talking about all the students, and I did not have the time. I did not have the time to actually go through and count every single individual. But so I'm just going off of what they actually wrote up in the paragraph. But I mean, that's an interesting question. I don't think they had that many. Let's put it this way: it wasn't like 50 or 60. Now, some of the people, I will say this, since you mentioned it, some of these gentlemen here going through the training as draftees, if they were exceptionally good in whatever their training, after they received that training, especially if they were in that first contingent that went through, then they could stick around and get permission not to go on active duty and stick around and train the second and third contingents. So that was a way to also fill the ranks of the instructors. Sir?
Yeah, do you know or do we have the list of all the soldiers that were trained at the university? And it's just me thinking outside, that would be a great memorial. Have a list of all the names and all the soldiers who were trained.
These gentlemen right here, I got from a local newspaper. Okay. There's quite a few more names with them that I have in my article here. Okay. Right now, it's the newspaper that really gives the most complete list that I've been able to find. And I mean, there's a couple articles that really give some details as far as where the guys are from, all their names. And I tried to look up information on as many of them as I could, but these gentlemen here, a few more that are in my article, were the most pronounced that actually did something. I mean, yes, there was one gentleman that ended up going to jail in the 20s. So that's the next time his name pops up because he gets some legal trouble. But I haven't come across like a roster of everybody. And I would also put this. When I was doing my dissertation was about the officer training camp up at Fort Worth. Okay, so I did quite a bit of research on that. One of the lists, and there's like 4 lists of graduates with different numbers. The official number that Emmett Smith in his book about African Americans in World War I, okay, he gives 639 graduating infantry graduating from Fort Worth, and then 104 doctors graduating. But when you look at other lists, there's another gentleman named Sweeney has a different number than 639. Maybe he had 625. Okay, and there's a few other rosters that have a different number on there. One list that was published in the Fort Des Moines, in the local newspaper, local black newspaper up in Des Moines, Iowa, had a complete list, and they said that that list was generated like 3 days after these guys graduated. But the problem was the only copy of that one document so far, someone had torn it in half. And then when the archivist scanned it, they scanned it so it's not one like this, it's like this. So you can't see who's in the middle. And I have dug and dug and dug and dug and dug and dug and dug, even National Archives and every place else. Everybody still has that one piece of paper that's torn in half. So personally, whoever that archivist was that put that on, I really, really, really don't wish them well. They probably passed away by now. But I don't wish them well. Because, that would have been the most important list. Because it said on there that, hey, it was the bystander newspaper. This was written, we're publishing this as the most comprehensive roster like 3 days after graduation, because Emmett Smith was actually standing there handing out the diplomas. I have the name of the colonel that brought the diplomas from the War Department to Fort Des Moines to hand up to Emmett Smith to hand out. But I got his name, but I don't have his roster. So I'm still looking for his official roster, but we got the bystander newspaper says we got the most comprehensive roster handed out to the public, but like I said, instead of like this, they scan it like that. Yeah, don't get me started. Ma'am.
So, sir, as you have noted there, I know that the university closed in 1943, but as we look at the interwar period between World War I and World War II, we know there was an expansion of military innovation, like in how we, built and developed tanks and aviation and other things. Did Western University, did it play a role in any of the military innovation during the interwar period?
No.
Okay.
Pretty much after World War I was over, the military didn't need the vocational training anymore, and they just stopped funding. They just stopped paying. So then Western just went back to providing vocational skills for the regular civilian student. I'm complete.
All right. Thank you so much.